The United States is not taking its finger off the trigger. It continues to threaten Venezuela. Last week, the foreign minister of Spain, José Borrell, not exactly an ally of the Venezuelan government, compared the current U.S. administration to a cowboy who pulls out its gun whenever it wants. In other words, he used the Hollywood image of conquering the far west to describe the U.S. administration, pointing a pistol at anybody while it violates international law and doesn't negotiate with anybody, maintains disputes open on various fronts. Meanwhile, Venezuela, its government, its people, and its institutions oppose this neo-colonial intervention. At the same time, that the world powers, other world powers, are a counterbalance. So, a continuing coup d'etat in Venezuela, attacks on its embassy, that's the topic for today's Critical Moves. On Monday night, there was tension at the diplomatic building, the embassy of the Bolivarian Republic in Washington. After several days of threats and attacks and actions violating human rights and international law, including local laws in the United States. That's the context. Of course, you remember that Venezuela broke off diplomatic relations with the United States after the government of Donald Trump recognized the self-proclaimed Juan Guaidó as interim president on the 23rd of January. Nonetheless, within the embassy, there are guests who, in the face of attacks by the opposition, have defended the diplomatic building in the name, and they call themselves the Embassy Protection Collective. Let's take a look at this document on the Twitter of our correspondent Alina Duarte. The Metropolitan Police of Washington have broken into the building. They broke the padlocks on the doors, and there they delivered an eviction document. It wasn't signed, didn't have any stamps on it. The activists who are in the building have been there since the middle of April. Nonetheless, the police then withdrew, and the Embassy Protection Collective continues inside the embassy. In this document, the government of the United States recognizes Carlos Vecchio and repeats his orders that everybody in the Venezuelan embassy should be evicted. That's what Alina Duarte tells us. The text ends with a threat that anybody who refuses to obey this eviction order will be breaking federal law and could be arrested and face criminal charges. The people inside were very clear. They were asked if they would leave voluntarily, and they said they wouldn't. They were very clear about their concerns over violations of international law, with the attacks by the U.S. government on the Venezuelan embassy, and the attempts by opposition supporters to break into the embassy and violate the Vienna Convention. They were completely non-violent, completely peaceful. They defend the law, they're defending international law, and they're demanding a peaceful solution with somebody to take care of, appointed to take care of the embassy. And they reject any violation of the Vienna Convention. They want to defend peace. We're a bit sad because we think that we had time to reach some kind of an agreement between the two governments to see what to do with the embassy, but we're still hopeful because they're saying that so far they won't yet hand over the embassy to the opposition. We don't know if that's true or not. For us, it's important that this embassy, like the embassy of the United States in Caracas, should be protected. And we don't know yet what they'll do with this embassy, whether they will leave it empty and wait for an agreement, or will they hand it over immediately to the opposition? That's what we'll have to see. We think that it's a struggle, it's still a struggle that is necessary. They've been inside the embassy for a month, and it shows there are people in the United States who are ready to make a real effort to defend international law. And we continue in that struggle because we don't want a civil war in Venezuela. We don't want a military intervention, a foreign intervention, in this case by the United States in Venezuela. And we don't want economic sanctions against Venezuela, which are affecting millions of people in Venezuela. So we keep going. So there we are. I want to show you now another tweet which shows you something of the opposition thinking. Carlos Vecchio, the self-proclaimed ambassador, the self-proclaimed Guaido, he says on his Twitter, to those who invaded our embassy and defend the usurping regime of, we have said that we are going to show them a bit of the experience, what it's like to live under the failed socialism of Maduro. From this moment, there will be no electricity, and the next step is their exit. So this gives an idea of the explains what the opposition have been doing. They're not trying to hide what they're doing or their methods at the embassy in Washington.
Digamos por qué decíamos, valga redundancia, que teníamos que desmenuzar. Y es que a propósito de nuestra primera jugada,
in this first move, we want to show some of the articles of the Vienna Convention on Diplomatic Relations that's been in force since 1964 and applies to all signatory states, including Venezuela and the United States. The Convention of Vienna on Diplomatic Relations of the 18th of April 1961, which came into effect on the 24th of April 1964. In Article 22, it says that diplomatic missions are inviolable. Agents of the host state, in this case the United States, cannot enter without the consent of the head of mission of the state accredited, in this case the Bolivarian Republic of Venezuela. The host state has the obligation, according to this article, to take measures, adequate measures, to protect the mission's premises against any intrusion or damage, and to avoid that the peace or dignity of the mission is disturbed. The premises of the mission, its furniture and other assets, including transport, cannot be searched or embargoed in any way. The same convention, Article 29, says that the diplomats are immune, they cannot be arrested, and the host country will treat with due respect and respect their dignity and their freedom. And in Article 45, it says, in the case of the breaking of diplomatic relations, temporarily or permanently, as has happened between the United States and Venezuela, the host country is obliged to respect and protect, even in the case of an armed conflict, the premises of the mission, as well as its assets and archives. The accredited state will hand over the custody of the mission and its rights to a third state which is acceptable to the host country. The accredited state. From this we can conclude that the United States is violating international law in this case by emitting an order of eviction Also, when it sends its security service and secret services to disturb the peace of the diplomatic mission and threaten the guests who are there. And also when it allows the followers of Guaido to attack the building and lay siege to the building and threaten the guests. When it uses measures like suspending water and electricity and preventing food from entering. And also when it recognizes an illegitimate government, which is not the outcome of universal, secret and direct elections as established by the Venezuelan constitution. Solely the activists of the Embassy Protection Collective have been given permission to enter the premises. So that's very clear. So let's look at some other digital sites, web pages. The Grey Zone. On the 9th of May, an article by Manar Mohawesh, founder and editor-in-chief of Mint Press News, saying that the members of these journalists from these media have been putting up with the electricity cut at the embassy. At the invitation of the Venezuelan government, there is the Embassy Protection Collective defending Venezuelan sovereignty. Now, and this says they were invited by the Venezuelan government to enter the embassy premises. They're not giving up in their resistance, and reporters from Mint Press News, Alexander Rubinstein, and from the Grey Zone, Anya Palampil, joined them. Both of them have stayed inside the premises, facing up to the ferocious attack on the freedom of the press, because the cutting of electricity makes their journalistic work difficult and prevents them from broadcasting live from there. And they also describe how there was violence exercised against a 70-year-old man who was part of the group defending the embassy, who was trying to take food into them. And they've shown how the police and the U.S. Secret Service are working hand in hand with the opposition supporters besieging the embassy. Telesur, on our own website, says that the United States recognizes its responsibility for the crisis in Venezuela. So here's the extract. So also this is from the Grey Zone, which published a classified bulletin from the U.S. State Department, where the United States admits its participation in the attempts to promote a coup in Venezuela. The document was dated the 24th of April. It was initially published on its webpage, but then, realizing that it incriminated itself, it rapidly removed the article from, but the Grey Zone already had it. Samuel Moncada, the permanent representative of Venezuela before the United Nations, said about this, just imagine if any country said it was proud of destroying the economy of its neighbor, or proud of destroying the political system in its neighboring country. And Pablo Siris said this is theft turned into diplomatic relations. And here's another article in Geopolitica RU. The United States and its hawks are leaving Venezuela. So somebody said that Guaido is better off dead for the CIA than alive. Then he's not managing to pull off a coup, nor is he exercising any power as interim president. He has no credibility. So will he become a victim? He's going to make himself a victim. Anybody would have declared him a traitor for promoting a coup. But since Guaido is no longer useful to the CIA, it wouldn't be surprising if the United States had him disappear and then blamed Maduro for it. So, the embassy defenders in Washington are still there. So let's go to our correspondent Jorge Estoso to see what the latest situation is there. Hi, Jorge. Thank you. Now, the embassy of the Bolivarian Republic of Venezuela is still being protected by the activists of the Embassy Protection Collective. Last night there was a development which was quite confused. Now, it was confused at the time. Now, what we know from the lawyer of the Embassy Protection Collective, who went to talk to a group of the police, he said that one group of police entered the porch of the embassy. They broke the padlocks on the doors. The lawyer was with them. They opened that door, but they didn't enter, according to the lawyer, to the building itself, but from the door they read to the activists inside an eviction order in which it says that they should leave the premises because they are trespassing illegally and therefore should leave. One of the activists is a lawyer, and there was also the lawyer on the outside. Since they rejected the validity of that document, they said it was absolutely invalid and illegitimate. The police closed the door and they went, and they left. So the activists are still inside without electricity, without water, without food, without medicines. And now it seems this was an attempt to intimidate the activists, to put pressure on the activists to leave of their own accord. What's happening now? Everything is the same, except that the police has completely they're now not letting the opposition surround the building, but they're still not letting food into the or anything else into the embassy. So what is happening now? There are two parallel realities here, juxtaposed. When you're in the United States, the logic of the United States is this government of Donald Trump has decided that President Maduro is no longer president of the Bolivarian Republic of Venezuela. There's only one president, and that's Juan Guaido as interim president, who has named an interim ambassador, Carlos Vecchio. Carlos Vecchio is now considered here in Washington by the Trump administration as the only authority. And this gentleman, Carlos Vecchio, has said that this property, the State Department has recognized Carlos Vecchio and the interim government as the only owners, proprietors of this embassy building. And therefore, they've asked the police to remove who they call the intruders, i.e. those who were invited by the government of Nicolás Maduro. So they say they're not violating any Vienna Convention or any law. On the other hand, the United Nations, the only government recognized by the United Nations is the government of Nicolás Maduro. But the United States has not only recognized Guaidó, and 50 other countries have recognized Guaidó. So, as the only government, but the United Nations only recognizes the government of Nicolás Maduro. The second biggest international organization, the non-aligned movement, which includes 120 countries and has at least 15 observer countries, has as its only president for the last 3 years is Nicolás Maduro as president of the non-aligned movement. He's still president of the non-aligned movement. So there are these two parallel realities. And so for these international organizations, this embassy belongs only to the government of Nicolás Maduro, and therefore the Embassy Protection Collective are their guests, and the version of the United States government which says that only the interim government, ambassador of the interim government, are the only legal proprietors. So it's in between these two parallel realities that the story is unfolding. Thank you very much, Jorge. So, given what international law says, we can see how serious what's happening at the Venezuelan embassy in Washington is. So, what's behind a violation of this kind? So, what comes next? We'll be talking to our analysts in the next block. Don't go away. Welcome back. So, a continuing coup in Venezuela, attack on the embassy, that's our topic today. So we'll speak to our analyst in a moment. So let's look at this on RT, New News. Lavrov on Venezuela, democracy cannot be ensured by force. So we were expecting this, a new meeting between Lavrov and the US Secretary of State, Mike Pompeo, the Russian foreign minister. They met in Sochi, and after the meeting, Lavrov said that about Moscow's position in relation to Venezuela, that democracy was based on the principle that democracy cannot be ensured by force. He also emphasized that Russia supports dialogue and a solution made by Venezuelans themselves without interventions. And of course they also talked about situations in other countries, and of course we remember what happened in Iraq and Libya and so forth. So the attacks by the Trump administration on Venezuela has combined various forms of warfare on different fronts, and one of those has been an attempt to evict people from the embassy in Venezuela. It all began on the 30th of April with the failed attempt to stage a coup d'etat, when and after that, opposition supporters gathered around the embassy in Washington. The U.S. operation has threatened those who decided to stay inside the embassy to defend Venezuelan sovereignty. There was an embassy protection collective was set up, which only recognizes Nicolas Maduro as the legitimate president of Venezuela. It's been supported by activists from across the United States. Since last weekend, many social movements have gathered around to support the collective. At the same time, supporters of Juan Guaidó have also gathered around the embassy, threatening those inside and often expressing sexist and racist expressions against them. In clear violation of the Vienna Convention on Diplomatic Relations, the U.S. authorities suspended electricity and drinking water to the embassy building and prevented food and medicines from being taken into the embassy. And the so-called opposition ambassador, Carlos Vecchio, at his orders, police broke the padlocks on the door and went inside the outside doors and read an eviction order, which didn't have any official stamps on it. And so this fictitious government, which doesn't have any territory or doesn't administer anything, has no armed forces, is being recognized, but the activists remain inside the building, resisting. More and more international media, like the New York Times, came to a press conference by the Embassy Defense Collective. So, let's go to our guest from the United States, James Petras, sociologist, writer, and a well-known student of imperialism, the class struggle, and conflicts in Latin America. So, James, the confrontation in the embassy in Washington seems to show, is the United States violating the Vienna Convention? Is it because they don't know the law, or because they're reinterpreting the law? In the United States, the main defenders of the constitutional rights, the main protocols of the United Nations and the Geneva agreements all agree that this is a mafioso operation, an action taken by thugs. It has no justification for such an act. In the universities, there is a generalized condemnation, and any researcher into the questions of international human rights, anybody who knows about that, is condemning such action, this attack on Venezuelan sovereignty. My personal impression is that since they failed in Venezuela, because they haven't been able to act in Venezuela, they are taking the opportunity in the United States, where the embassy defenders, thinking they wouldn't have the defense, the capacity to resist an offensive by the police and the military. So they're using this as a way of trying to recover restore their imperialist pride. But nobody here believes in this kind of action. There is a general sentiment that it's another expression of Trump's policies, who's attacking China, Russia, Nicaragua, attacking Iran, attacking Syria. It's involved in a generalized policy, belligerent policy, which has nothing to do with any real political, social, humanitarian justification. Guaido is the small thug who behaves like that, but he's so weak. He expresses his impotence, calling for supporting this attack on the Venezuelan embassy. Nobody here with the least respect for the sovereignty of countries in this country supports this action. Only the troika of Bolton, Pompeo, and Abrams, the three thugs acting in the name of the United States. So could this have larger international repercussions? Well, for the moment, there's no attempt to internationalize it. I think, at least, I believe in the principle. In Europe, they won't support this because it opens a Pandora's box. If the United States can attack an embassy, why can't others do the same? And the Europeans who face lots of problems around the world, especially in the Middle East, they cannot support an action which is so obviously illegal because it has repercussions on its own embassies in Africa, in Asia, and in Latin America or any other part of the world. So, on the basic principle of self-defense, I don't think any country would support such the U.S. actions. We shouldn't expect the Europeans to take a strong position on this, but at least I don't think they might just quietly say, "Stop, Washington. This is crazy, attacking embassies." Now, various activists who've been at the embassy have condemned the fact that the Metropolitan Police and the Secret Service are collaborating with this attack in a very open way, and this implies complicity between those security organizations and the opposition activists who are showing this active anti-Chavista face. Is this an example of what would happen if there were a real coup and Guaido was installed? Well, nobody much believes in the capacity of Guaido to really raise up a big movement. A U.S. invasion would confront 200,000 to 600,000 Venezuelan soldiers, 500,000 militia. Washington's current policy is to strangle the economy using sanctions, attacks on Venezuela's reserves around the world, on its oil exports, and so forth. The big cowards attack the few pacifists in the Venezuelan embassy, but that's rather different from invading Venezuela, where they would found soldiers, militants, disciplined and prepared, and they get involved in a situation where Russia, China, other powers who might and could provoke a much bigger conflagration. James, do you think that in this situation Is there a real movement against war in defense of Venezuela that could grow? At the moment, the majority of the people in the United States are not taking a position either in favor or against the Venezuelan government. What there is a majority for is against military intervention by the United States in Venezuela, because they have memories of the prolonged wars in Iraq, Afghanistan, Syria. In that sense, Trump cannot risk such military action against Venezuela. He thought there would be a military rising. He believed what Guaido said. Now nobody believes in what Guaido says, nor do they think anymore there's a possibility of mass desertions or military revolts. So Guaido is very discredited here. And beyond that, I think at the moment the United States public is against an invasion. But it's a silent majority, but they're quite quiet about sanctions. There's not so much public opinion against sanctions, except, of course, then you've got the gusanos in Florida who are very much supporting such sanctions. So it's interesting to know whether these activists who have been defending the embassy, so we can see that they do connect with the public opinion in the United States. So this Embassy Protection Collective say they want a sensible, peaceful solution to avoid a conflict. Do you think that's possible? Is it possible to have a peaceful solution? Could the United States government back down on this? There's a division between the permanent officials in the State Department and the coup mongers in Trump's cabinet. They are extremists. They're not very much well recognized in diplomatic circles. In that sense, Trump and whose three thugs are acting on their own. I don't think they dare to launch an invasion, but they are being criticized from many parts of the country with this attack on the embassy, including in diplomatic circles. People are saying that this is a big mistake, and I have to tell you, amongst activists, the activists have a lot of support from progressive sections of the church and the universities, but beyond that, it's but for most of the public, beyond that, it's just a spectacle. They don't like to see the police attacking activists and diplomats. Thank you very much, James, for your analysis. Thank you very much. Please keep going. The struggle continues. Thank you to James Petras for being with us on Critical Moves. So, following instructions of the self-proclaimed interim president, said, I have asked the Southern Command for a meeting to talk about strategic planning and operational planning. Amongst other objectives, amongst its objectives to restore democracy. That's what Carlos Vecchio, Guaido's envoy to the United States, published this, and this is part of new movements that we want to analyze in our last section of Critical Moves. After the failed coup on the 30th of April, the discourse of the opposition people seem to have a lot of contradictions amongst them. So, is the military option still open in Venezuela? We'll look at that and others questions after the break. So back to critical moves and the continuing coup in Venezuela. So what are the next steps in the intervention against Venezuela? We've seen they have not managed to produce any splits in the armed forces, for example. So let's look at what the analyst in Argentina, Marco Teruggi, says in his publication this Tuesday in Página 12. First, the head of the Southern Command, Craig Fowler, one of the leaders of the interventionist agenda, alongside Mike Pompeo and John Bolton, said that they are ready to talk about how we can support the future role of those leaders of the armed forces who take the correct decision to put the Venezuelan people first and restore the constitutional order, quote. Then on Saturday, Juan Guaido said that his representative in the United States, Carlos Vecchio, would make a formal request for a meeting with the commander of the Southern Command. Vecchio made the request in a public letter in which he said that Juan Guaido has asked me to confirm our disposition to begin conversations on cooperation which have been offered by the Southern Command to plan strategic and operational issues. According to the international analyst from Argentina, Marco Teruggi, there's been an anti-Russian escalation by Donald Trump, or a change, sorry, not only in terms of Venezuela, but also in the world, since marked by the way, given the outcome of the Mueller investigation into so-called Russian intervention in the U.S. elections. In this context, Agrega says that it's come out in the Washington Post and CNN internal tensions between Trump and his Venezuela team. The president apparently is unhappy with the way things have developed. The prolongation of the conflict, which he had been told would be simple to resolve, and the possibility that Bolton could lead him into a war. These differences have only just opened up, but is all part of broader strategic differences in different stages. Amongst these, Colombia has declared, through Vice President Marta Lucía Ramírez, that the position of the government is only one, is that the defense has dismissed any possibility of Colombia taking part in a military intervention. So let's analyze this. We have in the studio Ángel Rafael Totolero Leal, professor of the National Experimental University of Rómulo Gallegos and a former ambassador. As a former ambassador, I want to ask you, given your diplomatic experience, your view on the recent events at the Venezuelan embassy in Washington. Look, in terms of international law, I entirely support what has been said here, that a diplomatic premise like that has to be inviolable. But if we analyze it from the other perspective, saying there's no diplomatic mission, but the building itself is the property of the Bolivarian Republic of Venezuela, so there's an invasion of a private building in the country which promotes the ideal of private property, and so this is violating the rights of any property owner in the United States. In terms of international law, so the Convention of Vienna, that's correct, but we have to look at this. When we say it's an embassy that's going to be taken by the Swiss embassy, for example, then we're violating the rights of Switzerland, because Switzerland is the so they're talking to Switzerland about Switzerland taking over Venezuelan affairs in the United States. Switzerland recognizes Nicolas
a un presidente
Maduro as the
el
president.
presidente que hay en Venezuela es Nicolás Maduro.
That's the only president they
El señor
recognize.
Guaidó, pues otra
Mr.
jugada
Guaido
fallida del señor Guaidó y de
has
quienes les acompañan,
again
que creen
failed
que a
in
golpe y
his
porrazo
initiative.
van a resolver los problemas a nivel
He
mundial.
thinks that
El
he can
gobierno de
solve his
Estados
problems with
Unidos
this kind of
acepta
action.
a Carlos Vecchio como embajador, bueno, ese es el problema de los
The
Estados
fact that the
Unidos.
United
No sé en nombre
States
de qué
accepts
Estado.
Carlos
El mismo caso
Vecchio
de
as
Estados
ambassador is their
Americanos,
problem.
que es la organización de estados americanos y tiene un individuo ahí que no representa ningún estado.
But he doesn't represent any
No
state.
vale la pena ni siquiera nombrarlo. Entonces, bueno, estamos frente
So
a
what
una
we see
agresión directa
is a
contra
direct
una
aggression
propiedad privada en
against
nivel
private
del gobierno
property
del Estado venezolano
of
y
the
contra
Venezuelan
una
state
sede diplomática.
and
Ahora,
against an embassy.
actuamos en reciprocidad.
Are we going
La
to act
embajada o el
reciprocally?
local donde funcionaba la embajada de
Or
los
is the
Estados
building
Unidos
where the
norteamericanos
US
en Venezuela
embassy functioned in
siendo
Venezuela
protegido por las fuerzas de
is
seguridad
being
del
protected by
Estado
the
venezolano?
Venezuelan
Y
security
jamás
forces?
permitiríamos que
And we would
personas
never
no
allow
acceder
anybody
a ese espacio porque es
to
una instalación
attack
privada
it
del
or
gobierno
occupy
de
it
los Estados Unidos.
because it's the private property of the United
Entonces, los
States
Estados Unidos, ¿es un
government.
violador del derecho internacional? Sí, pero
So,
principalmente es un violador de la
So is it a
propiedad
violation of
del
international
Estado
law?
venezolano
Yes, but
en
principally it's
Venezuela.
a violation of the property of the other state.
Creo que no, bueno, creo que habrá
I think
las medidas.
for example,
Una interpretación de la interpretación, ¿sabes? Es decir, como
It's an
no hay una alegación
interpretation or an
diplomática, ese
imputation.
edificio no está consagrado como una sede diplomática.
So they say,
Y no goza
since
de
there's
la-
no
del
diplomatic
privilegio que él-
delegation,
que
this
le
is not a
corresponde.
diplomatic building.
Pero bueno,
But nonetheless, it's the
está lo
property of
otro.
the
El
Venezuelan
propietario de
state.
ese edificio no es Juan Guaidó, el propietario del
Obviously,
edificio no es
the
Carlos Vecchio.
owner of that
Propietario del
building
edificio
is
no es
not
Hay una cuestión,
Juan
una
Guaidó,
tercera
it's
que
the
no estoy
Venezuelan
muy
state.
seguro, pero creo que está allí.
There's another
Aparece
question, I'm not
cuando el
absolutely
Estado
certain.
venezolano le otorga un permiso
When the
especial,
Venezuelan
vamos a llamarlo así,
state
a este grupo de compañeros
gave
que
permission
están
to
apoyando a nivel
these,
internacional, que están custodiando
the
la sede
embassy
diplomática y protegiendo los bienes que allí
Defense
están.
Collective, Protection
Recordemos
Collective.
que las embajadas tienen secretos, documentos, tienen una cantidad
So
de
I
elementos
think they have.
que ningún Estado acreditante en el planeta Tierra se atreve a tocarlo.
So,
O sea, eso sería una violación flagrante también allí. Y esta gente que está allí goza
so those people
de la
enjoy
autorización por parte del
the
Estado
authorization from the Venezuelan state.
Sí tiene una suerte de protección que no sea reconocido por el Estado acreditante. Toda protección diplomática
All
es el
diplomatic
Estado
protection,
acreditante el que te la otorga. Tú puedes ser
the
embajador,
right to
extraordinario,
protect an
plenipotenciario,
embassy
y
is
lo eres
given by the
específicamente cuando el
accredited
Estado
state,
te
not by the
recibe
host state.
las credenciales, entonces ahí gozas de la protección de las inmunidades y privilegios
And
que te
they
consagran la ley.
enjoy the immunities and so
Para-
forth
para
of the
el país
Vienna
para
Convention.
nosotros, para cualquier país del mundo, enviamos
So
un
for any
representante diplomático
country-
y este se hace efectiva su representación en el momento que pisa el territorio.
So when you
y
arrive
es
in a
aceptada
country,
sus credenciales
your
en ese
credentials
régimen
are accepted by the host
No
country.
quiero dejar de preguntarle, pide la derecha a través de Carlos Vecchio,
Will the right
intervención del Comando Sur, ¿qué tipo de diplomacia
demand
es?
Eso
the
es
intervention by the
es
Southern
una
Command?
vergüenza.
This
Una
is
vergüenza. Yo
shameful.
creo que Carlos Vecchio, pues,
Carlos
debe cambiarse
Vecchio
la nacionalidad.
really should
Eso no
change
lo
his
hace ni el
nationality
peor ni más detestable ser del planeta Tierra, pedir una invasión a su casa, pedir una
to
invasión a su pueblo.
request an
Eso no lo ha
invasion of
hecho
your
nadie
own
en el
country.
planeta, nadie, a excepción de aquellos cipayos
Nobody has
que
done this before,
se vendieron como tal.
except
El
people
caso
who
de lo que
completely
acaba de
sold
hacer Carlos
themselves to
Vecchio,
a
mira,
foreign
yo,
power.
las leyes venezolanas son específicas. Es una demostración flagrante
It's a flagrant
traición a la
demonstration of
la misma demostración
treason,
flagrante que
to the
hicieron
country,
los diputados estos que acompañaron
the
al
same
prófugo de la
as
justicia,
committed
Leopoldo López, y se pararon frente a una instalación militar armados
deputies,
hasta los dientes.
the people
Allá
who
hay
accompanied
una flagrancia,
Leopoldo Lopez
bueno,
and the others
taxativa, no
in
hay
this
discusión de que
open attempt
estaban asediando una
at a
instalación
military
militar y
uprising on
prometiendo
the 30th
el
of
golpe
April,
de Estado. O sea, ya no era una
promoting a
suposición
coup d'etat.
por
It
el
wasn't,
hecho. No,
this was not
fue dicho, fue
a
anunciado,
theoretical
fue
thing, it
mantenido
was
por estos señores.
there for everyone to see, and they said it.
Vecchio, mira, que la historia se encargará de juzgarlo.
So
Yo creo
the
que va a
justice
ser más
system will
temprano
have
que
to
tarde, ¿no?
take its
Decíamos
position.
nosotros en nuestra editorial que
In
las
our
potencias que ejercen
opening
el rol de
words,
contrapeso
We
internacional
talked
cuentan,
about
están moviendo sus
some
cartas,
states
por segunda semana
acting as a
consecutiva,
counterweight
se ven
here.
las caras,
Again, we
Pompeo y
see
Lavrov.
we've seen the
Allí
meeting between
reseñábamos lo
Pompeo and
que
Lavrov
medios
today
internacionales,
with international media.
reflejan o resumen de lo que decía Lavrov. Hay que hacer valer la democracia, no aceptamos
that we don't accept
una intervención,
any
meridianamente
intervention
rechazamos eso, y ha sido la postura
in Venezuela,
sistemática.
and that you can't
Sí,
impose
Rusia ha
democracy
tenido
by
un papel
force.
protagónico en esta
The
discusión
Russians
con
have played a
los
leading
Estados
role in
Unidos.
this.
Bueno, que somos protectorado de Rusia, no.
Is Venezuela a protectorate of Russia? Obviously not. Nor of China. We don't have. What's at stake is the world geopolitical balance. And in Venezuela, this balance is being played out. But Russia is claiming, in the name of humanity, in the name of peace, that we can't allow the United States to invade or submit a country. Then tomorrow they could do it against Russia, against Turkey, against any other country. The fact that these 50 countries who have recognized Guaido are already taking their distance from the United States position. We can already see people, even Trump himself last week, in an interview, I think, that was that the attempt to remove Maduro had failed because we didn't have the support we were told we had. So, as a hypothesis, I think we might see Pompeo, Pence, and Abrams might leave the Trump government, and Trump may redesign his policies towards Venezuela. The idea that the president was tricked, misled, obviously it weren't, because obviously they meet and talk. But there might be, we hope this might be the case anyway. In terms of what Lavrov has requested of Pompeo, they didn't have any agreement, Lavrov and Pompeo, on Venezuela. But first, that the legitimate government of Nicolas Maduro is not disposed to any negotiations that isn't about achieving peace. But there's also the question of the balance that's needed that Venezuela demands. What are those? Firstly, that our assets abroad, some $30 billion, that you allow us to trade. You're trying to kill us with hunger, starve us to death. And the Venezuelan people have understood very clearly, whether they like Nicolas Maduro or not, that Mr. Guaido are asking for more sanctions, so that's obviously nobody wants that. And if they don't get involved in political talks, then they're going to disappear off the map. There's a joke about this. My mother, who's 91, who isn't Chavista or not Chavista, deserves to have a space where she can speak. So let's go to our conclusions. So there is general condemnation of what's happened in the last few hours at the Venezuelan embassy in Washington, which enjoys protection. It's a clear aggression against private property, against the property of the Venezuelan state. The operation points towards a narrative of increasing. Is it about the demobilization and crisis amongst wider supporters? James Petra said in the first part of the analysis that as they failed inside Venezuela, they're now trying to regain ground outside, as around the embassy. It also shows the difficulty that Guaido has in exercising any kind of power and building his support, and also that Venezuela continues to be right in the middle of geopolitical tensions, and we know there are many fronts to this, and Venezuela is one of them. We come to the end of Critical Moves. Until next time.